Okay, when you think about the biggest threats to global fish stocks, your mind probably jumps straight to, industrial trawlers, massive commercial operations out in the ocean.
Right, the really visible stuff.
Exactly. But here's the paradox we're kind of unpacking today. What happens when literally millions of people doing something for fun, for leisure, collectively impact the environment?
Hmm.
That weekend hobby of recreational fishing. Well, globally, it's actually a major driver of resource use, maybe exploitation, and it turns out it needs global rules, just like any major industry.
That's precisely the context for our deep dive today. We're looking at the framework for setting up those global rules, and we're drawing heavily on this key paper, providing context to the Global Code of Practice for Recreational Fisheries.
Okay.
It was led by R. Arlinghaus, S.J. Cooke, and I.G. Cowx. And it's really essential because it details the whole creation and the rationale behind the European Inland Fisheries Advisory Commission's Code of Practice for Recreational Fisheries. We'll just call it the COP for short.
The cup. Got it. So our mission here is pretty straightforward then. We need to figure out the fundamental reasons why this specialized COP was necessary. I mean, don't global fishery regulations already exist?
They do, yeah.
So we'll look at how it tackles the unique issues, social, ecological, ethical, tied specifically to recreational fishing, and what sort of minimum global principles it lays down for, getting towards real sustainability.
Okay.
All right, let's unpack this. We already have the UN's Code of Conduct for Responsible Fisheries, the CCRF. That came out in 1995. It was huge. Why wasn't that enough?
Well, the CCRF was a massive success in many ways. It really influenced global fisheries management, no doubt about it. It fundamentally raised global awareness about unsustainable commercial practices.
So the focus was commercial.
Primarily, yes.
Yeah.
Its main focus stayed squarely on marine commercial fisheries.
And so recreational fishing just sort of slipped through the cracks.
Exactly. Even though recreational fishing has, dramatically increased its socioeconomic footprint, its ecological footprint too, especially in industrialized countries and transitional economies. The CCRF just didn't provide adequate guidance. It didn't really recognize the sector's global significance.
And that failure left a huge vulnerability, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because while maybe the public sees it as a pretty benign activity, just someone fishing off a dock,
Sure.
the scientific evidence paints a different picture. What are the documented impacts that really force the issue?
The sources are quite clear on this. Recreational fisheries exert significant pressure. We're talking about high fishing mortality rates.
Oh.
And that includes both the fish people take home to eat, the harvest, and the fish that die after being released in catch and release.
Post-release mortality.
Right, yeah. And beyond just catching fish, management activities tied to the sport, like introducing non-native fish species for stocking purposes that can seriously destabilize entire ecosystems. And this impact is often, totally invisible to the general public.
That invisibility, that lack of public awareness, makes a global standard feel really urgent. Recreational fisheries worldwide face similar threats: pollution, habitat changes, climate change impacts, and they also face these conflicting societal views about whether it's okay or not. The authors really stress that this COP, this Code of Practice, is designed specifically to complement the CCRF, not replace it. It's about providing those specialized ethical and environmental minimum standards that should apply wherever someone casts a line for fun.
But before they could even set any rules, they hit this first, pretty fundamental challenge, just defining the activity. It sounds simple, right? But how do you scientifically and legally draw a line between recreational fishing and, say, subsistence or commercial fishing?
Yeah, I'd assume it's maybe about money or time spent. Like if you sell the fish, it's commercial.
Yeah.
If you do it on your weekend off, it's recreational. Isn't that basically it?
Well, that's sort of what they thought initially, but those definitions turned out to be too restrictive or just didn't capture the reality. If you define it by leisure time, what about retirees or people who are unemployed?
Good point.
And definitions focusing only on sport ignore the huge number of anglers who aren't competing at all. They needed something much broader, more inclusive of all kinds of non-commercial fishing, but also something that clearly excluded fishing purely for essential food.
Okay, so that sounds like a really sticky problem. How did they end up solving it?
They did something pretty novel, actually. They pivoted and used Maslow's hierarchy of needs as the sort of philosophical foundation.
Maslow, like the pyramid of needs.
Yeah.
For fishing regulations.
Yeah, Exactly. They argued that commercial fishing and pure subsistence fishing, they sit at the base level of the pyramid, meeting those fundamental physiological needs for livelihood, for basic nutrition.
Okay.
Recreational fishing, they argued, sits higher up the hierarchy. It's fulfilling more psychosocial needs, relaxation, connection with nature, challenge, social interaction, that sort of thing.
Huh? Using Maslow's hierarchy. That feels a bit abstract for regulating fishing. How does that translate into a practical, legally usable definition?
It actually creates a surprisingly clear and non-discriminatory boundary. The generic definition they finally came up with provides this clear demarcation. It goes, recreational fishing is fishing of aquatic animals that do not constitute the individual's primary resource to meet nutritional needs and are not generally sold or otherwise traded on export, domestic, or black markets.
Ah, okay. That is a critical distinction. It means the definition is broad. It includes catching things like crabs or crayfish, not just fish.
Right.
And it doesn't automatically ban keeping fish to eat, as long as that catch isn't your main way of feeding yourself or your family. It really focuses on the purpose and the outcome, not the specific method or whether you have spare time.
Precisely. So once they had the activity properly defined, the focus could shift to the actual practices involved.
Which brings us neatly to core challenge number 2, environmental stewardship. The COP isn't just about limiting the negative impacts. Article 5 actually promotes the value of recreational fisheries while mandating stewardship. And they define stewardship as the moral obligation to care for aquatic environments and the actions undertaken to provide that care.
And this is where the paper moves from the philosophical, the why, into the practical how. Article 8 lists these key best practices that everyone should adhere to. They're designed to minimize local impact and, importantly, maintain social acceptance, social license.
Okay, what are some examples?
Well, the first one is pretty fundamental. Don't take more fish than you actually need for immediate consumption by yourself, your family, maybe close friends. It's really about discouraging wastefulness.
Seems like common sense, yeah. But some of the other practices get more into the weeds of ecology, right? I noticed a really strict guideline about moving species around.
Yes, and this is absolutely crucial for preventing ecological disasters. The code mandates strictly avoiding stocking, introduction, or transfer of any aquatic organisms without official permission, and that applies even to something that seems minor, like using live bait fish you caught in one lake and then taking them to fish in another river system.
Right, that can spread diseases or invasive species. Makes sense. And we can't forget the old problem of lead weights either.
Nope. The COP tackles it head-on. It requires minimizing the use of lead weights and strongly encourages using alternatives wherever possible. And finally, environmental care extends beyond the water, avoiding damage to banks, preventing littering, of course, and making sure you're not disturbing wildlife, like waterfowl, especially if they're nesting nearby.
Okay, now we get to what sounds like the trickiest part. Core Challenge 3, fish welfare. That's covered in Article 9. And the paper notes this was highly debated because, well, as you mentioned earlier, recreational fishing inherently involves causing some level of stress and potential injury to the individual fish.
That's the ethical tightrope, isn't it? At the core of the sport. The team developing the code was apparently quite split on how to even define good welfare for a fish in this context. They ultimately rejected what they called the feelings-based approach.
Why reject feelings? I
Right.
mean, surely whether the fish suffers matters.
Oh, it definitely matters. But the issue, scientifically, is that this approach focuses on unpleasant mental states, things like fear, pain, discomfort. And these are notoriously difficult for scientists and therefore policymakers to measure objectively. How do you write a regulation based on something you can't reliably quantify across different species or situations?
Right, it becomes subjective and hard to enforce consistently. So they needed something more pragmatic.
Exactly. They opted for a function-based definition.
Okay, what does that mean?
It means focusing on measurable indicators of the fish's physical state. The definition they adopted is, good welfare means that an individual fish is in good health, with its biological systems functioning properly and with no impairment of fitness. This gives a hard, sort of scientific standard you can use to assess different practices.
Okay, so function-based. What does a properly functioning biological system actually demand from an angler in practice? Give us some concrete actions based on that definition.
Sure. So for catch and release fishing, the main goal is minimizing the duration of the fight, using gear that's appropriate for the fish size, not too light, and crucially, minimizing how long the fish is out of the water, the air exposure.
The air exposure time.
Yes, studies like some classic ones by Mecca and McCormick or Ferguson and Tufts, they clearly show that even brief air exposure can severely impair a fish's ability to recover its overall fitness.
Okay. And what about for fish that are harvested, kept for food? The requirements there sound surprisingly intense.
They are very specific, yes. And it's all about minimizing suffering and ensuring a rapid death. The code actually requires immediate anesthetization and killing, preferably before you even take the hook out.
Wow. Vor dehooking.
Yes. And the prescribed method is a sharp blow to the cranium. They call it cerebral percussion, followed immediately by exsanguination, which is just bleeding it out.
Cerebral percussion and bleeding out. I mean, that sounds like something a professional butcher or fish processor would do, not necessarily a casual hobbyist.
Yeah.
That really shows how seriously they took that function-based definition.
It really does. And furthermore, if fish are kept alive for a period before being harvested, say, in a tournament or just keeping them fresh, they must be held in suitable devices, things like large keep nets or properly aerated live wells that give them enough space and maintain water quality.
So no stringers then? Or those small metal cages?
Explicitly discouraged, because they clearly impair the fish's biological function and often cause physical injury.
Okay, so those rules are very focused on the individual fish. Let's zoom back out a bit to management. That's Article 11. How does the COP try to shift the way entire fisheries are managed beyond just individual angler behavior?
It pushes hard for two key concepts: the ecosystem approach and the precautionary approach. Management can't just focus narrowly on one target fish stock, how many bass are in this lake.
Right.
It has to be holistic, integrated. It should aim for the conservation of biodiversity across the entire aquatic environment, considering all the interactions.
And given how complex these systems are balancing fish populations, the whole ecosystem, and human desires rigid, fixed rules probably don't work very well. The paper talks about adaptive management, right? Learning as you go.
Absolutely. Adaptive management, which people like Carl Walters really championed back in the 80s, is essential here. Because there's so much uncertainty in these complex recreational fishery systems, management needs to be flexible, constantly monitoring results and adjusting tactics. It's about finding that tricky balance between providing good fishing opportunities while staying within safe ecological limits and meeting societal expectations.
And for adaptive management to actually work, you obviously need good data. But the paper notes that research specifically on recreational fisheries is often, well, pretty sparse and kind of siloed.
Yeah, that's a major hurdle. The COP actually dedicates a whole article, Article 12, to the need for new knowledge. And it stresses that this research needs to be applied useful for managers. It needs to be multidisciplinary, bringing in the ecologists, biologists, but also critically social and economic scientists.
Why the social and economic side?
Because we need to move beyond just counting fish. We have to understand fisher behavior, their motivations, their preferences, the economic value they generate, how they respond to regulations. That's often missing from traditional fisheries biology.
So, practically speaking, what are the absolute must-have data points that managers need to collect consistently if they want to monitor these fisheries properly?
Well, the basics include things like catch data, what's being caught, harvest rates, what's actually being kept, the structure of the fish stocks, like the age and length distribution, and fishing effort, how many people are fishing for how long.
Standard fisheries stuff.
Standard fisheries stuff, yes. But crucially, they also need consistent data on the human dimension. Fisher preferences, their attitudes, their actual behavior on the water. And all of this data needs to be standardized so you can compare across different places or times, and it needs to be verified somehow to ensure accuracy. That's what feeds that captive management cycle.
Okay, so we have this scientifically sound, ethically pretty robust, and ecologically mindful code. But as you said, it's voluntary guidance. It's designed for regional interpretation. So what's its real impact likely to be if it isn't legally binding everywhere?
That's a key question. I think its most profound impact, at least initially, is political and social. It formally elevates the profile of recreational fisheries. It sends a clear signal to policymakers, to governments, to big environmental NGOs that this sector is a major player in how we use or exploit world fisheries. It needs a seat at the table in conservation discussions.
So adhering to the COM, even voluntarily, actually provides a major benefit to the recreational fishing sector itself.
Absolutely. It helps open up a more productive global dialogue. It gives them a clear, science-backed framework for resolving conflicts, maybe between different groups of anglers or between anglers and conservationists. And importantly, it helps improve the sector's public image by showing a real commitment to verifiable, responsible environmental stewardship.
Right, it builds trust.
Yeah.
So what's the proposed path forward then? How do we make sure this COP doesn't just stay as a very thoughtful document on a shelf somewhere?
That the authors make a strong case that it needs to be institutionalized. They argue the COP should ideally become an official annex to the FAO's main code of conduct for responsible fisheries, the CCRF.
Ah, integrated into the existing global framework.
Exactly. That would grant it the formal recognition needed to ensure that governments, FAO member states, and even international alliances like the European Anglers Association they mentioned have a clear structure for adopting it, for developing it further over time, and importantly, for updating it as science evolves. It gives it longevity and, well, more teeth.
So this whole deep dive really shows that recreational fishing is undergoing a fundamental shift in how it's viewed, doesn't it?
Mm.
It's moving away from just being seen as harmless fun, pure leisure, towards being recognized as this globally significant activity,
Yeah.
one that genuinely demands formal, responsible, science-based guidelines. And this paper, this COPS, it basically provides the blueprint for that change.
And that shift, that recognition, it creates an incredible opportunity, I think. Recreational fishers are often, the most knowledgeable and passionate advocates for their local rivers, lakes, coastlines, especially freshwater systems, which often get less attention. If this COP is fully adopted and institutionalized, just imagine this huge global community of anglers becoming potentially one of the most powerful and effective lobby groups in the world for aquatic ecosystem health.
That's a powerful thought. So the question for you, the listener, to maybe consider is this. If the very people who fish the most become the most active and informed guardians of those aquatic environments, how might that fundamentally change the political landscape of conservation? And maybe closer to home, what role could you play in promoting this kind of awareness and stewardship within your own community?
Something to think about. Keep exploring those possibilities, and we'll catch you next time for the next deep dive.